I have a very exciting guest on today's episode. Glenn Wakai is a Hawaii state senator and has been a politician for over 20 years after a decade long career as a broadcast journalist here in Hawaii. Glenn was also adopted from Japan at the age of 1.5 years old and subsequently grew up here in Hawaii with his adoptive family. He's vocal about his experience reuniting with his birth mother after 47 years and is now actively involved in the adoption community and advocates for child welfare policy issues in Japan alongside his birth mother, who he stays in contact with. I first learned that Senator Wakai was adopted while attending a welcome event for children from Holy Family Homes, which is an orphanage in Japan, who were being hosted by the 27th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army earlier this summer. I sent him an email asking him to be on my show right after the event, and he immediately agreed and also sent me an article he'd written for the Hawaii Herald back in 2016. So I will link the article in the show notes because it's incredibly powerful, and I'm so grateful for Senator Wakai's willingness to share his story in the media given the lack of representation of adoption stories, which we know. It's also really great context for today's episode. I'm very inspired by Senator Wakai's involvement and activism in the adoption community, and am excited to have him on my show and to continue working with him on adoption issues for many years to come. So, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your adoption story? Anything that you feel comfortable sharing, but where you're adopted from, if you know anything about your birth parents, how, if and I mean, how and when you found out you were adopted.
I entered this world in 1967 as Mitsuru Shimabukuro. My mother at the time was at the age of 15, very incapable as a child to raise a child. So I was born in Tokyo, Japan, and given up for adoption. Due to unbelievable blessings and luck, I was adopted by a family from Hawaii. The Wakais fetched me from Japan in that orphanage at the age of 1.5 years old, brought me to Hawaii, where I lived a very blessed life. I went to public schools, then I went to Midpack for high school, then I went to the University of Southern California in LA, got a journalism degree. I started a TV news career that began in Guam, eventually took me to Saipan, and eventually I was able to come home. I did TV news for 11 years. That was a very fun, rewarding um, occupation and career. But at the end of the day, it was kind of empty. As a journalist, I'm telling other people the viewers, what other people are doing. And I wanted to be part of the folks that were actually doing something. So I left the TV news business in 2002 and have been in the legislature ever since. I'm going on my 22nd year in public service, and I love it because I get to learn about all things relating to Hawaii, and I get the opportunity to do things that the average citizen can't do. My proudest moment so far is being able to, as a lawmaker from Hawaii, go back to Japan and talk to folks that are in the Diet. That's their equivalent of the U.S. Congress in Japan, because in Japan, laws are made on the national level. Municipalities and provinces, they don't make laws. It's the national government that provides the political and social and economic direction of the country. So, in my capacity as a state lawmaker in Hawaii, I was able to talk to my counterparts in Japan and joined a crusade somewhere in the 2000 time period. Excuse me, 2014 time period, where there was a movement in Japan to have society embrace children and no longer put as many of them in orphanages and move over towards foster care, which is what first world countries like the United States provides for their neglected children. And was able to work with Diet members there, and proudly can say that that movement uh, effectuated a positive policy change in Japan, where in 2017, I think there was maybe 12% of Japanese uh, children were put into foster care. Now the law says that in 2030, that 12% needs to go to 30%. Not quite where America is. In it's about 90% of children who are neglected are landing up in foster care. But I mean, I can say that 30% is far better than 12%, which was the situation a number of years ago. So when I leave politics and leave public service, I think that will be my greatest political achievement. It's not so much what I did for the people of Hawaii, but what I did for future children in Japan and the Mitsurus of the world like myself who become whatever they can become and have a positive influence on the greater community.
That's awesome. So it sounds like in your public service career, you've been really passionate specifically on child welfare. Do you feel like being adopted influenced that or inspired that?
Sorry, I forgot to mention what really changed the entire mindset for myself was back in 2014. My adopted parents, Calvin and Ruth Wakai, unfortunately passed away. My mother first in 14, and then 5 months later, my adopted father, Calvin, passed away from a broken heart. So in
Mm,
2015, I was parentless. Luckily, my wife is a Japanese national, and she, on her own, went to hunt around for who was Mitsuru's birth parents and
wow.
was able to find the agency that put me up for adoption, and they in turn were able to get in touch with my biological mother who still lives in Okinawa, and we were reunited in 2000 and latter part of 15, I think maybe 2016. And that reunification really ignited my interest and passion to go and see how uh, children who might not have the best of care, the best family surroundings, how things can be better for them. Because to be honest, before all of that took place in my reunification with my mother, it's something I never really talked to anybody about,
Mm,
even as a child, and certainly not as a politician would I have broached the idea that I'm going to get in front of these adoption and child welfare policies.
mm. Yeah, I read your article that you wrote about your story, your adoption story, and you shared that you have a pretty close relationship with your birth mom now. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct.
Wow.
So she checks on me when there's Maui fires, and I check with
Mm,
her when there's typhoons in Okinawa. So we keep in touch. I would say we talk, not every week, but maybe twice a month, and certainly birthdays, holidays, and such. Provide warm greetings to each other, and we try to make it to each other's locale every year. So I went to Okinawa last year, and she's hoping to come to Hawaii this year. So every other year we go and visit each other in each person's home.
oh, that's awesome. So it sounds like you travel to Japan a lot for work. Do you remember what it was like the first time that you went back to Japan after you were adopted?
That one is a hard one for me to answer because I really, my parents, as soon as I could understand as a child what adoption meant, they talked to me about it. And I could recollect that perhaps was when I was 3 or 4 years old. And they said that they were not my actual biological parents. So I don't recall any particular trip to Japan after that, but it's not something that I ever really cared to explore as a child because the Wakais gave me a life of unbelievable blessings. So I
Mm,
was not, not really longing to find out the history and the origin of who Mitsuru Shimabukuro was. Actually, in
mm,
fact, I didn't even know that was my birth name until my parents passed away in 2015. So I really just had no desire nor inclination to go and delve into my birth history. It's
mm.
something that only came up, when you go to the doctor's office and they say, okay, what's your family history? Heart disease, lung disease, brain, whatever. And I could never say that I knew anything about it because the doctors here had to start from scratch with me because I didn't know what my family history was. But that was
Yeah.
really the only time when that issue ever had to kind of cross my mind.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, that is something that I think people who have biological, who are raised by their biological parents take for granted is having access to medical history. And that's something that we prepare our adoptive parents for is that when have an adopted child and you bring them to the doctors, they're going to ask for medical history. And you're not, for the most part, unless you're in an open adoption, you're not going to be able to have that information, and it's going to significantly impact the healthcare that the child receives. So you talked a little bit about your career. I'm really personally very interested in the work that you did for over a decade in broadcast journalism. I did undergrad at Syracuse University, which has a really big um, journalism school. And so I wasn't a journalist by any means, but I was in close proximity to it a lot. And I just have like a personal interest in broadcast journalism. And so I'm curious what inspired you to pursue um, that as your initial career endeavor.
Syracuse was actually one of the universities I looked at. I looked at Syracuse, Northwestern, and USC and Missouri. I think those were the top five or so uh,
Mm,
colleges with journalism programs. But what really spawned my interest in the power of the media was when I was a student at Mid Pacific. I was the editor of the school paper, and at that time, I got the first taste of what messaging and engagement can lead to in terms of positive outcomes. It was something small, but I wrote articles way back 35 years ago to create more student parking, which is an issue at many high schools around America. And to this day, there's a parking lot that I helped create back in the 1980s that is there today. It's that kind of power of the media that compelled me to make a career out of writing and messaging to the public.
mm, very cool. In what ways do you think that being adopted impacted your identity or your life trajectory or, the person that you are today?
The person I am today is an individual that still loves children. If I wasn't in the political arena, I probably would be in a classroom. I
Mm,
really enjoy uh, children and I enjoy mentoring children. For the past 14 years here at the legislature, I have an internship program where I bring five high school kids into my office from January until May. And every day we go through whatever the agenda has in store. And I follow these young people who are now, many of them are adults with families of their own, help them chase internships, help them chase scholarships, help them along in life. And I really believe that that is important because every child has value. Not everyone has the opportunity and blessings to thrive on their own. A lot of them need mentorship, need a little assistance along the way. And I just see that that's my give back to society, considering all that I had growing up. Have a responsibility to pass that on to others.
mm. Do you think that being a Japanese person adopted by parents in Hawaii in a place that has such a rich Japanese culture, do you think you had a unique adoption experience because you were surrounded by a lot of other Japanese people growing up?
I think that Hawaii, with its large Asian and Japanese population, made it easier for me to acclimate here. I mean, if I was in California or someplace on the continent, it might be a little bit more difficult. And it was easier because I was adopted by a Japanese family, so it was kind of easy to fake people out to think like, oh, that's my real adopted parents. I didn't have to explain stuff, right? So if they were Caucasian, Hispanic, African American, I'd have a lot of explaining to do, but I never felt like I needed to explain because I kind of easily slipped into the presumption that Mr. and Mrs. Wakai were my biological parents. So I didn't have any sense of disconnect and needing to kind of explain myself to those who are outside of my immediate family.
Oh, okay. That's great. Something that we talk about a lot here is like when people assume that you are an adoptive family, they ask a lot of questions, and sometimes those questions can be difficult to answer, or it can feel like, an invasion of privacy. And so it's great that you didn't feel the pressure of having to, explain yourself or explain your family. How do you think that adoption in general, your own adoption, but just, what you've learned since you have begun your work in Japan, on various child welfare policies, how do you think that adoption has impacted your view of the world?
It's made me a much more compassionate individual. Oftentimes, I think in life we take what we have for granted. And I am just so lucky that I had a different trajectory in life because in Japan, when you matriculate out of the orphanage system, one of three things happens to kids there. You either commit suicide, you're sex trafficked, or you become a criminal, mischievous individual. I mean, those are the vast majority of the outcomes for adoptees. And thank God that was not my destiny. So I just feel incredibly, incredibly blessed to be in the position to, as a child, just chase rainbows and do whatever I wanted to do. My parents had the resources to send me wherever I wanted to go and pursue whatever I wanted to. They never for once told me, you need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer, you need to be this, that, or the other thing. They just let me run wherever my desires would allow me to. So I just feel that that has given me an opportunity and a responsibility to make it better for children that are coming up after me.
That's great. Um, so what are some unique issues about adoption that you've seen here in Hawaii, both personally and as a politician?
In all honesty, I think it's one of those things that people in the public we just don't talk about. I mean, we hear about foster care issues, but
Mm,
we only hear about them when it's something tragic, when something goes wrong, like that
mm,
young girl that died in Waimanalo.
mhm.
Waimanalo. We
Yeah.
rarely hear about foster children who thrived and who are brought up in really good, loving families. Although that's the vast majority of cases, we don't really hear about those successes. And I think that's an important part of getting the public educated on the fact that we have a lot of adoptees or foster children in our community and that they are just regular human beings, just like anyone else. They shouldn't be seen as somehow having a handicap or a disability in life. We all have
Mhm,
different sets of circumstances in which we are brought into this world and in which we grow up in the world. And it's really up to human behavior to figure out how you're going to be successful and stay away from the path of destruction.
mhm. That's a really great point. Thank you for sharing that. But the Congressional Coalition on Adoption is the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute is an organization that was founded in order to provide members of Congress with information and resources regarding adoption. Last year, Hawaii was one of two states that wasn't a part of the coalition. This year, we're one of a handful. Do you happen to have any idea why that might be?
Well, I've never even heard of the Congressional Coalition for Adoption until you just mentioned it just now. So now that I do, I will find out more and figure out how I can go talk to our four congressional representatives to see how and if Hawaii should be part of this coalition.
Hmm. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, the Congressional Coalition on Adoption, we just started working with them recently, but they're really great and they provide a lot of great information for not just the members of Congress, but for, the constituents as well. So, what's something that you, as an adoptee, would want other adoptees to know?
That being adopted is something that you should look at as a blessing. It's a strength. It's not a weakness,
Mm,
because the fact is someone brought you into their family, provided you a loving environment, provided you support. There are a lot of folks that could choose not to do that. So the fact that any adoptee is finds a way into a family is just a huge, huge win. And hopefully, with that first step, um, and I know a lot of adoptees have a lot of issues to kind of resolve in their minds, right? I mean, everyone gets into adoption not because of the most pleasant of circumstances, right? They're probably, in most cases, something that's not so positive that led them to having to be put up for adoption or foster care. And but I find that the strength to overcome that makes you even far more resilient of a person, and just have a very different compassionate outlook on life, because perhaps one might, and I don't think that I started off in the best of circumstances, but I certainly am not going to go to the grave whining and uh, and crying over why I was treated unfairly at the beginning. I plan to
Mm,
leave life glorifying others and making sure that I did 100% of I could with being a positive influence on society. So it's just, I think, a matter of perspective, and it's easy for me to say because of what I said earlier, that I was brought into a family with great resources. Not everybody's quite that lucky, but everyone has the opportunity to make a positive impact in life.
mm, that's great. Thank you. What's something that you want people who are considering adopting a child to know? So that would be adoptive parents, potential adoptive parents.
I first of all think that they are saints and angels to even contemplate bringing a child that's not their own into their family. That is a huge, huge shift in mindset, because society to this day, I don't think, looks at adoption as, um, I shouldn't say negative, but it's it, it's a circumstance which needs a lot of explanation. And for an adoptive parents to have to kind of explain, well, who's this new kid in my family? When you have your Christmas get-togethers and stuff, and having to explain that isn't the easiest thing for any adoptive parents to have to go through. So I applaud them, anyone who is willing to take on that added responsibility as an adoptive parents. And then once the child is in your custody, and it just depends on how much effort, how much polishing you put into that child, which will allow them to reach their highest potential in life.
Mm. That's great. That's a really great perspective. Thank you. A question that I always ask all of my guests is recommendations for books, movies, or TV shows about adoption that represent their experience. But I know you said that you haven't ever seen a movie, book, or TV show about adoption that represents your experience, which goes to show how little representation there is of adoptees in media. But have you ever considered creating something yourself, like writing a book about your experience or producing a like film or?
The farthest I've gone is putting that out in that newspaper article, and I was on Hawaii News Now talking about it. And I don't know, I'm not egotistical enough to think that my story is extraordinarily interesting. Um, I do think that it has some very uh, interesting elements to it. The fact that at age 47 I was reunited with my birth mom is just
Yeah.
astonishing to me. Uh, but I just, I'm open at this point in my life to freely speak about my history. Even as a child, I always thought of it as something embarrassing. So not a single one of my friends knew that I was adopted, and actually kept that a secret until age 47, when things kind of all lined up for me. And then all of a sudden, even my political colleagues like, what, you're adopted? Not that that was a
Mhm.
bad thing, but just one of those things that uh, it's not like it's written on my face, but it's not, there's not a wound or scar or something on my history that says, oh, this guy is adoptive. It's just one of those things that I kept quiet, and decided at age 47, like, I'm going to stop being quiet. I'm going to try and share that adoption isn't always a negative. It can really be, and it should be, and it actually always is a positive, that someone took a chance on a child that was neglected and poured resources and time into that child.
Mm. Well, we're so grateful to have your voice as a part of the community now, even if it took a few decades to get there. And we'd love to have you stay involved with our organization. We have, events from time to time, and I think it would be really cool for the people in our community to know that, there's someone in your position that has a similar experience as them or their kids. And I think it's really cool, to have you as like a representative for those positive experiences, like you were saying, that aren't always as put in the forefront of the media. So
Thank you for reaching out to me because, going back to my reunification with my birth mom when she came here to Honolulu in 2017, of course, she apologized and I forgave her, and everything was tearful joy, joys of tears. But in that same interaction, I told my mom, her name is Yoko. I told Yoko that this cannot be a happy ending just between Yoko and Mitsuru. That we have to go and create more happy endings for other Mitsurus in Japan that were coming up after me. So that
mm,
really, and her, what she said in response really made me cry was that she said Mitsuru, I haven't been there for 47 years for you, so whatever you want me to do, I'm willing to do it now. So within 6 months to a year, we were back in Japan going on to that campaign that I spoke of earlier, where we're talking to NGOs, government officials, and trying to push Japan to be more like first world countries in putting their children into foster care. So
mm.
utilize me any way you would care to see that I would be a positive influence, Sheila. It's wonderful that you even are putting this community together, and you count me in on being supportive as you see fit.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Please remember to subscribe and leave a rating or review. Follow our socials at A Family Tree High. And if you have any feedback or know someone that should be featured on our podcast, please head to our website, afamilytree.org, and fill out the form on our podcast page. If you'd like to make a donation to our organization, you can do so on our website as well.